Small utilities serving fewer than 10,000 people make up the vast majority of water utilities in the United States. And they also have really, really small staffs, oftentimes only 1 to 5 people. So when infrastructure funding, PFAS regulations, lead and copper rule, communications, cybersecurity, when all those things come knocking, balancing priorities is really, really challenging. So what can we do about that? I'm Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest, and I am joined today by Manny Teodoro. He is Associate Professor of Public Affairs at the Lafollette School in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin. Um, Te- Manny, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be with you.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about drinking water utilities, some of the things that they're balancing in terms of priorities. It feels like there's so many more, double, even triple the priorities than a normal year for drinking water utilities. Could you talk about that? Like, how are these utilities trying to balance all these different competing priorities they have going on right now?
As an empirical question, I don't know. It would be a really interesting thing to study as a guy who studies organization. It's in some ways, I guess to use the Charles Dickens cliche, it's best of times and the worst of times. I mean, we're at a moment when
Hmm.
the water sector in the United States is getting attention that it hasn't had in 50 years. And that is exciting and a little bit scary, right? There's a lot of political attention, there's a lot of media attention, there are a lot of resources flowing into the sector. Those are all good things. It's good to have that kind of attention. The bad thing is that with all that attention, with all those resources, comes a lot of pressure and new challenges. Right? There are old challenges that we're dealing with, and there are new challenges that we're dealing with. So how are they doing it? I think there's a lot of leaders sort of flying by the seat of their pants, doing the best they can to meet the many challenges in front of them. One of the fundamental things about the water sector is it's so complex. Water touches everything, right? Well,
Hmm.
almost literally, water touches everything, and certainly figuratively, it does. We're wrapped up in economic development and public health, in environmental protection. We're at every level of government. We're key to any facet of our economy and society. And so, of course, there are multiple demands and multiple goals. This is not a sector where we just have one thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to do lots of things simultaneously. So I don't know how substantive an answer that was to you, but I think what's going on is that utilities are trying to balance a lot of things, and it's hard. It's hard optimizing across 17 different goals every single day.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of dovetails really well into the follow-up that I had, and hearing what you're saying, it reminded me of another question. It's kind of like on the other side of the coin. So on the one side, you have what in what areas do utilities need the most assistance right now, and then on the other side of that coin is what are some of those competing priorities that they're dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, I think the areas where they need the greatest assistance, at least in the United States, where what we need is capacity. And by that, I mean organizational capacity. Well, in
Hmm.
some places, they might literally need physical capacity. You might need a bigger pipe, you might need a bigger
Hmm.
reservoir. We're seeing that in much of the American West. But when I say capacity, I'm speaking as someone who studies management and policy and organizations. You know, I don't have to tell you, and I probably don't have to tell any member of your audience that the American water sector is almost unbelievably fragmented. We've got 50,000 community water systems. We've got something like 15 to 17,000 wastewater systems. The vast majority of those, probably more than 90% of them, are very, very small. I mean, we're talking about small organizations that serve fewer than 3,000 customers, probably have fewer than 3 full-time employees. If you throw in the billing clerks and administrative staff, you might get all the way up to 5 or 6 full-time employees. And as the world becomes more complex, as the public demands more of us, as regulators demand more of us, as environmental challenges crop up and demand more of us, the human capacity to address those challenges, I think, is the place where we need the most help. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, it's one of those places where utilities don't always get what they need. I think the natural impulse when politicians and leaders are thinking about, public policymakers are thinking about infrastructure programs and infrastructure services like water and sewer, they naturally think of the physical infrastructure. And that's important. We need that. But just as important is the human infrastructure. We need that human capacity, and too often that's lost, right? We don't have that. So to me, that's where it's most badly needed.
Yeah, there is kind of this dichotomy where technology is really useful and can solve a lot of problems, but you also need the humans to implement that technology. And if those don't mesh well enough together, you kind of find yourself at a standstill where it's like, we don't really know how to use this to the best capabilities, so it's actually creating more problems for our already strapped workforce.
Oh, absolutely. Look, and I want to be absolutely clear about this. I'm not going to sit here and tell you more people is always good. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to quadruple the size of their staff. No, 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 no. We make, we make labor capital optimizing decisions all the time. And in any productive activity, there's some optimal mix of labor and capital. And as we get better with technology, one of the great things about that is we can do more with fewer operators. I remember touring an old water treatment plant, more than 100 years old water treatment plant in Miami one time. And I remember them telling me that when this plant was built, it had to be staffed around the clock by 15 to 20 operators. And today, that same plant has, in the daytime, maybe half a dozen operators, and overnight they might have two. Right? And that's because so much of that plant is automated. We're talking about an enormous treatment plant, and so that's wonderful. That's a great story. I'm really talking about the same sort of things that you're saying. When you've got a small water utility with 3 full-time employees, and 2 of those people are in a pickup truck or driving a backhoe all day long, they're not going to be doing things like satellite leak detection, right? They're not going to be playing with the new SCADA technology and implementing the latest greatest water quality monitoring instruments, right? It's just because they don't have the capacity to do that. And
Yep.
That's really what I'm talking about here. You have to reach some minimum threshold to even take advantage of the latest innovations on the capital and technology side.
I totally agree with you. I think that it makes a lot of sense because sometimes that technology is actually so beneficial for them, but they just don't have the time or resources to make it work. But if they did, it could be hugely beneficial. But I mean,
Sure.
like kind of thinking about that in another way and looking at it from a different angle is, like how can engineers and OEMs and manufacturers and solutions providers and those kinds of folks, how can they try and meet some of these utilities where they are? What are some of the ways that they should start looking at some of their products and services to help provide some of that assistance that could be really beneficial to a lot of these smaller utilities?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'm gonna first sort of cop out of your question and give you a cheap answer, and then I'm gonna do my best to engage with your real question. People who know me, have been following my work, know that I'm going to say the answer is that we should not have so many small utilities. That what we really need is consolidation. We need to consolidate these organizations, and the best way for a small utility to get over its small utility problems is to stop being a small utility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Combine with other organizations, and then you'll have the capacity you need to engage with those technological innovations. Okay. Now, what do we do now in the world where we've got 50,000 community water systems run by tens of thousands of agencies, most of which are tiny? Well, the consultancies and the OEMs out there have to as you said, meet them where they are, create technologies that will serve those markets. And then maybe what the answer is going to be is find ways to advocate with regulators and with policymakers to say, look, you need to help us help them. Look, the consulting engineers of this world, the equipment manufacturers of this world, they're in a business. They're out there to make a profit, right? Of course, they're there to help the world too. That's why they're in this business and not some other business. They're not cryptocurrency traders, right? They're here to make the world a better place, but they also can't take a loss on every project that they do. And you're not always going to have the scale if you're trying to help a little community that has 500 customers and 1 operator. That's not going to be a real profit center for a large organization. So it's also in the interest of the OEMs and the service providers to drive that kind of consolidation. And where they can't drive that consolidation because there are legal or political barriers, is to work with the regulators to say, hey, look, we want to help these little communities over here, but you've got to help us make that a viable and sustainable thing. On our best days, I used to work full time in a consulting firm. On their best days, consulting engineers are doing public service, right? They are helping expand the human capacity of organizations that otherwise wouldn't have it. Every utility would love to have a whole staff of environmental, civil, mechanical, chemical, electrical engineers at their disposal at any time that they need it. There are only maybe a handful of such utilities in the entire country. The rest of them require that kind of service. No utility has the capacity to manufacture all of its own equipment. And so they rely on those manufacturers to provide them with that capacity. But again, you have to have a certain scale of organization before you can even take advantage of those. So
Yeah.
overcoming those scale problems.
Yeah. Very interesting answer. I really appreciated that. That's something it's giving me a lot of different thoughts now to think about.
Okay.
But yeah. Well, thank you so much, Manny. I really appreciate you taking the time with me today. For everyone who's watching, check out our video description below. We have some links to resources on our website, and we can share some links that Manny might find useful for you as well. And once more to you, Manny, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Bob. Hope to talk with you again soon.